Hi, everybody. This is Lecture 10, Environmental Ethics. So this will cover both rights and duties and then also the other aspects of next week. So 2 weeks on environmental ethics, just going to do this one lecture. And again, I'm just trying to throw some things out there that perhaps I either didn't see the book cover in the way that I would like you to hear it, or maybe just augment something, okay? So when we talk about environment, we're talking about all visible things. If you're a theist, you would say all created things. Environment and nature, can be terms that are interchangeable, but just so we understand that there are various senses of nature. In other words, nature could be like the natural world, and I'll try to use it that way when I mean it, to express all the things within our natural world, as opposed to the nature within a particular thing or being, humans, plants, animals, minerals. In other words, that sense, nature means substance or essence of a thing. That's a little more controversial. Not everybody believes that there are absolutely, we should say, essences that are necessarily attached to a particular being. But that aside, okay, we will try our best not to conflate the two. So when somebody says in nature, we have to make sure, are we talking about in the, substance or essence of a thing, or are we talking about in the natural world? Okay, so in environmental ethics, we're going to ask, like, how is it that we use these things um, responsibly that exist in the environment, or perhaps even can we use them? Like, what's our relationship to those, for instance, right? Do we just keep the earth, inhabitable for humans? Do we keep it inhabitable for other species? What's our ethical relation to those things? Um, Planet will just do fine with or without the human species. We'll talk about that shortly, a little bit later. And then we talk in terms of extinction and like what is the role or the ethical value of the human person's actions in relation to these extinctions. You may have heard the statistic that 99% of all species who have ever existed were extinct prior to the human's arrival on the planet. Well, that begs the question then. We can't hold the natural world in, how do you want to say, responsible for extinctions that it itself caused, be it by asteroids, volcanic eruptions, just natural climate climate change shifts and such, right? But we also have to admit that there's been a lot of extinction that has happened since the humans have arrived. So we're going to have to look at that too. Like they say that we're in another mass extinction period. And by that, I mean that the extinctions that are going on now are roughly 1,000 times more than normal. Some people even go as far as 10,000 times, but let's just say 1,000 times to keep it on the low end. We are responsible for that. So what's the ethics involved in there? We'll have to look at that. I'm going to try to make a direct case in the end, whether or not it's our power to contribute or to diminish the present environmental crisis that we are in, right? And even if somebody has an argument about global warming and says, well, I think that, we're really, the climate change isn't something that is predominantly human, how would you say, doesn't stem from human consumption. I think it's a little hard to make that case, but there are some people who, would say that. We could at least agree that there are certain things that should be done. I mean, there's no sense in us consuming more than we need. So, there's always like common ground in here, and sometimes it doesn't pay to get somebody to agree to your premise if they're going to agree with your conclusion. So maybe we'll see how things go about there, right? But nonetheless, all this idea of use and waste and emissions, they have ethical aspects that are connected to those, right? And we also have to ask ourselves that, as we in a developing country, I'm sorry, we as in a developed country, have already experienced industrial growth and economic prosperity that were attached to that. And if that has contributed, which I believe it has, to our present crisis, then what's our ethical relation to these developing countries who have not yet experienced the growth, nor have they witnessed any particular advantage that we have gotten from it? So in other words, what I'm saying is this: if we're asking some developing countries, hey, like India and such, like, look, slow down. You guys are really destroying the planet. They could easily turn to us and say, well, you guys already did, and you've already reaped all the financial benefits from it. And now we are being, asked to not have access to the same future and goods that you have in your developed countries. That's an ethical dilemma in itself. I mean, what is our relationship to those other particular um, countries, right? And I'm going to post something in the end. I'll tell you about a nice little documentary you can see on that. Anyway, we're going to look at just real basic three ethical approaches, or at least a few. We'll look at Immanuel Kant, we'll look at John Rawls, and we'll look at some theistic, particularly from Christian and natural law ethics, because it was presented in your book and such, right? So with Immanuel Kant, this is anthropocentric. So in other words, we're looking at the environment into the way that it affects the human person. Which, let me just say on the outset, that's not some egotistical type of approach. Very few humans, and to be honest, I've never even met one that says that we should preserve the planet regardless of how it affects the human person. It's the continuation of the planet itself that is important, not the continuation of the human persons. So let's not make this out to be some dichotomy, like in other words, it's us or the planet. So to say that how is it that we can enjoy the resources here on the planet in a way that preserves those and also diminishes the effect it has on climate concerning the human person, if that's anthropocentric, it doesn't seem like unreasonable to me. Okay, so anyway, that's my opinion, right? So the environment itself with Kant wouldn't have some direct, ethical, how do you want to say it? It's hard to respect the environment per se in any way unless it's analogous to the human person, right? Because he has this kingdom of ends. So everything is determined in sense of how does this work as an end for the human person. Therefore, anthropocentric, right? Now, there is an aesthetic type of pleasure that we get from nature, so that could be brought in to bear on this, right? And if some animals were threatened, like as a species for extinction or such, the ethical value of that situation, according to Kant, is determined by its impact on human inhabitants. So we wouldn't look and say, well, are we missing something? Is this good in itself? That this particular species is going extinct, or do we look at it as it's not good because of the effect that this might have on humans? He would say the latter, right? Now, in contemporary times, there's been this push to expand a little bit of his understanding of ethics towards the natural world in what would be called as like a biocentric, a biocentric approach, right? So, Arne Naess, he says we can find some intrinsic value, right, and we all participate in this particular ecosystem. So he calls it a biospheric egalitarianism, right? In from this section that we would find maybe even like the eco-terrorist, you'd find some of the maybe the more extremes in that way. But nonetheless, it's an expansion on it. Your book talks about this, so I'm not going to go into it. I'll leave it there. With John Rawls and his Rawlsian justice theory, right? There's always this integration. He has the ability to integrate in his theories justice for the greater good. There's sort of a consequentialist understanding there, right? And also, like our self-interest. So, maybe you tie into some of the egoism of Ayn Rand, and also the understanding of universality of rules. So we can think in terms of Immanuel Kant or even natural law ethics, right? That how do we apply something to everybody? But his understanding is that we enter into some sort of social contract. So there's some people that say this is difficult to apply to environmental ethics. How does some rational beings, as in humans, enter in a social contract with the irrational natural world? That's a little difficult, right? So maybe we'd have to just try to say that animals and plants, perhaps if they're threatened or you're brought into extinction, that the ethical value of the situation is determined not just by the impact it has on us, but on future generations, right? So there's an environmental group out there, I think called 7 Generations. You look and see like what is the impact of what I'm doing on the next 7 generations as a community and as individuals. So you can, in theory, even though it's sort of still a little analogous, enter into a social contract with the rational beings of the future. So we have a duty to preserve for other human species. Okay, so there's like still the selfish element there, but we're looking for something more universal, and we are looking at consequences. So there you have all those, at least those 3 types of ethical systems being brought to bear in the Rawlsian justice theory. Okay, now natural law theory, as far as beginning with the Stoics and then through Thomas Aquinas and preserved predominantly by the Roman Catholic Church, it does look at things in terms of design, right? So you would look at inclinations of the human person, and the design of the human person, the design of various things within the natural world, and then teleology. You would determine the outcome or the purpose of that, and then anything that would frustrate the movement towards that goal then would be seen as some sort of injustice. Now, the text says that it would be fall that plants and animals being useful to humans, and therefore it's a sin. It's not a sin, and there's no direct moral responsibility to the environment. That's bewildering to me. All right, so this is not obviously a theology course, but somebody as a professor, both at the graduate and undergraduate level in various aspects of theology, bioethics, and such, I could tell you I don't even understand what that point is. All right. There's what would be known as an ecological solidarity within Roman Catholic theology. In other words, solidarity is not just an interconnectedness, but an interdependence. Now, perhaps the Earth is not so much dependent on humans as the humans are on the Earth, so there's a little bit of an analogy going on there. But nonetheless, natural law is not going to just look at population growth and birth control and such as means of controlling the effects of the human person on the environment, right? I thought that whole thing was so poorly framed. So, just to give you like a real short understanding is that within theistic, particularly Roman Catholic doctrine, there's something that's known as the universal destination of earthly good. So all things on earth are meant for all people, right? And this is the foundation for the common good. And the common good is typically defined as the total sum of conditions that are necessary for either us as individuals or for communities as a whole to develop more freely and easily. Right. So anything that frustrates those things, it includes our involvement with the natural world, have a direct moral and ethical import into how we. In other words, you can't use these things willy-nilly. All right. So I didn't quite understand his point on that. To be honest, I don't think it was placed very well. Just to leave this, Pope Francis, put out an encyclical, just a writing called Laudatio Si. It's framed as on the care of our common home in 2015, and it directly impacts and talks about environmentalism with issues, social issues. So the author was right that within theistic terms, oftentimes environmentalists pushed under the social ethics or social justice category. But how can it not be? I mean, even if you're an atheist or agnostic, we'd understand that poverty, technology, and modernism, and all these things have an effect on our consumption and the environment. So we'll leave it at that. All right. Okay. Lynn White Jr.'s, he talked a little bit about that, the historical roots of our ecological crisis, where he places, the onus directly on Christianity and its anthropocentric relation to the environment. You could think what you like on that. I just would try to place it in terms that where I frame the argument for environmental ethics is really on what's within the human person's control, and typically that's industrialization, consumption, and how we use things, and that is not something that's really connected to a particular theistic or atheistic sense. Unfortunately, whether you're a theist or an atheist, we tend to overconsume. So I didn't quite get that argument. Okay, so the other aspect here that we need to consider is that there's a hierarchy to values. I mean, if we even look at this from a anthropocentric point of view, we have to realize that if we're talking about the nature of a thing, like the being or the essence, is that whether it's animal, vegetable, or mineral, no human person is going to put like a mineral. I shouldn't say none. It'd be rare to find a human person who would put a particular mineral on the same level as an animal, or an animal the same level as a human. We'd understand that the interdependence of these things, but we would still place values on those particular things, right? So we would look at things like a pristine shoreline and such, and we would say this has what we would call an intrinsic value. I mean, it needs to be preserved, right? So we have these preservation areas, and but we base the value for that particular thing on what we imbue it with as an intrinsic, or we understand to be an intrinsic. It could be imbued if you think it's a construct, right? There are even elements within all beings that we would say have absolute value. We would tend to talk about innocent human life. I mean, we would probably not be so concerned about a particular species at the risk of innocent human life. We do this all the time with invading species and such, right? We would try to remove those species or bring in something to compete if we think that's going to impinge on the physical health of an individual, perhaps even mental health. Okay, so let's not. Nonetheless, these things can never be used for the sake of something else, right? We're not going to take something and use it to the point of extinction, but we're still going to place the absolute value on something what we call a higher level of being in the hierarchy of values. And then what we have these other things that we call instrumental values, right? There's certain usefulness to the human people. We realize that they're part of an ecosystem, and that's important to consider, right? Here we're talking more in the realm of stewardship, right? Okay, just to be clear, I'm talking about, three different types of values in hierarchy: instrumental, absolute, and now here, I'm sorry, intrinsic, absolute, and here instrumental. So like, let's say somebody, maybe they don't have a particular fondness for hunting for sport, right? Let's say if you grow up in the North, you probably experienced deer hunters, people that hunt deer. You might say, well, should we be killing these animals simply for the sport? Well, if you grow up in a rural area where there's many deer that roam around, it's not that uncommon to go for a walk in the woods and find, even dozen deer lying dead somewhere from starvation and such. So there are officers that are set to control the populations of these, and that's all done through licensing, right? So here you have sort of a stewardship, right? There's an instrumental role involved in the human person to help control the populations, which, to be quite honest, if they were not shot, probably would either starve or die from other aspects of disease and such. I'm not an expert on that particular area, but you get it, all right? Okay, two last things before we're done here. One, saving the planet, right? The reality is the planet's just fine without us. When we talk about from an anthropocentric point of view, about saving the planet, we're really talking about saving the planet in the sense of keeping it inhabitable for us who are the inhabitants, the human people, right? It'd be the absolute highest level of arrogance to think that this planet needs the human person to save it. It'll be just fine after us. It was just fine before us. If you ever get the opportunity, go in on YouTube and look up George Carlin when he talks about this particularly. The guy's extremely smart, extremely funny. He's also a little crass and uses off language. So if that upsets you, stay away from it. Okay. But nonetheless, he talks about how the planet's been here for 4.5 billion years, right? And here's the situation. We would talk about like the use of plastic, right? So like plastic might take 1,000 years to biodegrade or such. It remains that long. And so some people even say 10,000 years. It just depends. Nonetheless, it's going to be here after we're each of us, you and I, are dead. So, how does this affect the planet? Well, if all humans left tomorrow, the planet would be just fine 10,000 years from now. He goes on to joke that perhaps since all these materials that made plastic came from the planet, that perhaps this, the planet would consider plastic to be one of its children. And if you're talking 4.5 billion years compared to 1,000 or even 10,000 years it takes for the plastic to biodegrade, here's to put it in point. Let me read this. If it takes 1,000 years for plastic to decompose, remember that it takes 1,000 thousands to get to a million and 1,000 millions to get to a billion. So times all that by 4.5, and that's how long this plastic is going to be in perspective of the life of the planet up to now. That for humans, different story. For plastic and the planet, it's going to be just fine. Last thing to leave it on. This is an ethical perspective that I think is something that you and I can take away today. Okay, overconsumption. It's not controversial to admit that in the United States we consume more than we need. I don't know how anybody can argue other than that, right? So housing from the 1950s has gone from 1,200 square feet with a size of family that's larger than today. And today, the average size home is 2,600 square feet, if not creeping up to 3,000 square feet. So what are we doing all this extra house? And on top of that, we have storage units. They're all over the place. You can't drive around a city without seeing storage units. We didn't even need these things 30 years ago. So we have more than we need. Okay, that should not be too much of a controversy. Also, it says the U.S. has 5% of the world's population, but consumes 24%, almost 1/4 of all the world's energy production. That's astounding, right? So we could live differently. We brush our teeth, we could not run the water. We could watch what lights we turn on. We could watch when we turn them on. We could watch what things we leave running when we don't need those. I mean, we could watch how far we drive. We could watch where we go on vacations. I mean, we can go on and on and on. There's no sense me laying all that out. If you want to, I'm going to put up a link to a documentary. It's by the Nat Geo channel put it together. It's called A Race Against Time, India's Stand on Global Warming. They take celebrities and they go through these like Living Dangerously series. This particular one is by David Letterman, and he's comparing energy consumption in India and their use of solar energy in order to try to refrain from using so much fossil fuels compared to us in the United States. And it's not just one of these things where it compares the use and makes one feel guilty over the other. That might be part of it. But it talks about how these alternative energy use in the United States is really thwarted because of unethical, how do you want to say, unethical positions that some companies take. So I don't want to go into it so much because I want to let them make the case. They do it quite well. It's like 40 minutes or so. So I'll put a link. Take a look at it. Maybe I'll even put a question up. I think it's just highly recommended. It's going to be, I'll put it in the module. It's something good for you to review. Okay. So that's it, guys. I look forward to this discussion. I read every blessed thing you guys write. Okay. So don't think the fact that I don't comment bothers me. I want to leave you guys have all the discussion, but I really enjoy it. All right. Okay, guys. See ya.